All right. So I know two or three of you, but to introduce myself briefly, I'm a retired journalist and scholar of history. I have no degree in history, but I've been studying American history since the mid 1970s. And that has been my avocation for quite some time. I do have degrees, but they're in philosophy and social work. But that may be relevant to you, it may not. But I'm an older person, and I have devoted myself to these kinds of studies of the potential of the history and what I believe was the potential of the American Revolution over the past few years. I have a blog called American System Now, and I'll tell you a little, and I have a book, which some of you are aware of, and I will tell you about that. This class, I should tell you, is in part of my reason for giving it, when it's obviously not the last word, is that I'm preparing another book on this subject. And I will gain from the insight of people listening and arguing and discussing the matters at hand. So with that, I am going to start sharing my screen. I would, unless you have a really burning issue, I would appreciate being able to go through the whole PowerPoint before the class, before there is discussion. I will make every effort to allow at least 20 to 30 minutes for discussion by the end. If I'm not doing that, I will try to shorten things so that that's possible. Is that okay with everybody? Any objections? All right, very good. Yes, everyone should mute. Everyone see that? Yes, okay. So this is a four-part class, and I have been asked why it's a question at all, why American slavery persisted. But I believe that it needn't have persisted because of the degree of opposition to slavery, which was evident during the first 200 years of our existence. And I will make the point of what I've discovered that I believe supports that idea. So in the first class, we will discuss the establishment of slavery and the early resistance. The second class will go through the period of the revolution itself. The third class will go through the constitutional period. And the fourth class will go through what I consider to be the turning point, which really doomed us to a civil war in order to end slavery. So where did this, wait a minute. My starting point was my work on Hamilton. In the course of, I have focused on Hamilton's nation-building policies, which are laid out in his report on manufactures. And the book that I did in 2019 would provide significant background to my thinking and eventually to the major point of this class, which besides the fact of documenting the fight over slavery from early on, also will argue that the chance we had to stop slavery, to end the slave system, without a civil war lay in Hamilton's economics and the industrialization policy that he put forward. So if you have a chance to look at this book, I have them available. It's also in the library there at Shenandoah. At Shepherd. So that was one of my starting points, and looking at Hamilton's record against slavery. My other starting point was the assessment by Abraham Lincoln, who said, and he was born not all that long after the Revolution, 1809, and knew people from the Revolutionary era, and he did intensive studies of what happened in that period, and his view was that the founding fathers all thought slavery was on the way out. His reasons for thinking that have generally not been discussed other than in literary production, but I believe there's a lot of evidence to support it, which we will be going through. The depth of the anti-slavery movement in this country, which of course was not totally dominant, or we wouldn't have had the compromises that we had, but it was definitely a fight from the very beginning and was very widespread. In fact, I would argue that the American colonies were the center of the global anti-slavery movement. And what you saw in Britain and France and other places was actually heavily inspired, and there was also collaboration between Americans and the anti-slavery forces in those countries. This is the emblem of the anti-slavery movement, which came about in 1787. This particular piece of art, which was done by Josiah Wedgwood in England. It was sent to Benjamin Franklin, who was then the head of the Abolition Society of Pennsylvania, and became a long-term symbol of the movement. But I indicate that to you just to, I think many people think that this came about really in the 1830s, but it was much earlier than that there was a national symbol and organizing in this respect. So I think that gives you something of an overview of where we're going. And now let me go to the content of the earliest. We'll start with the early establishment, because I think here there are also lots of surprises. The shorthand about our history has really been significantly distorting, in my view, and there's a lot to learn. So I'm beginning with a couple maps, which unfortunately, if we were in person, I would be passing them around the room and you could really see them. Unfortunately, we're not. These maps are overviews of the slave trade from Africa, and I got them from one of the leading members of the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. So he came out to Leesburg, Virginia, which is close to where I live, and gave a lecture approximately 2-3 years ago. And he began with this map, to my surprise, and said that, as the map shows graphically, that essentially 5% of the slaves that came from Africa ended up on the North American continent. The bulk, as you can see, ended up down there in South America or in the Caribbean. This first map is not just the transatlantic slave trade, it also includes, as you can see, the trade up toward Europe into the Arab countries. And the numbers that he has on the map are basically 15 million shipped from the African continent, About 3 million of those are the ones that don't come to this hemisphere. 12 million coming across the Atlantic. And this is the transatlantic per se. If you could see the map, which unfortunately you cannot, you would see where the bulk of those, that huge line coming to the north is about 2.6 million souls. And the major components of that are, let me see, am I getting that right? The major components are going to Jamaica and Cuba. And as you know, Jamaica was a British colony, Cuba was a Spanish colony. So the slave trade itself is dated to, of course, slavery existed in human history long before this. We won't go into that. But the slave trade from Africa begins with the Portuguese around the middle of the 15th century. Very rapidly, the Portuguese decided, then they initially did bring slaves to Europe, who did were enslaved there. But soon after, they decided that that was too disruptive or whatever, and they effectively consigned the slaves to their colonies. And the Portuguese actually ultimately did not continue to be the major carriers of the slave trade. They hired it out to other countries, the Dutch in particular, and many others. And eventually everybody was involved, the French, the Danes, the Belgians, and eventually the British. The British were actually latecomers to this to this horror. This Royal African Company was set up in the latter part of the 17th century. Charles II, after winning the Civil War in Britain, allowed a group of merchants to get together to get involved in it, and he chartered this company in 1672. And by 50 years later, the British were dominating the trade globally. They had taken over and were doing most of the shipping and most of the profiting. And the center, as you saw from the maps, was sending slaves to the Caribbean. This is a graphic representation of someone's idea of what was going on. You see the guy hanging from the tree back there. Nothing very benign going on about this. The Caribbean islands were an incredibly rich center for the imperial empires of Europe. The sugar was the major product, and the amount of labor that was required for that was considerable. Initially, indentured servants were brought in from the European countries and put to work, and then they didn't like it. It was hot, it was grueling, they were very poorly treated, so it became harder and harder for them to import, to lure or kidnap, which they did, the indentured servants. So they got the idea of importing slaves, which they began to do. The conditions were incredibly brutal. In fact, the life expectancy of a slave brought from Africa to work on these plantations is estimated to have been about 7 years. And life was cheap. They simply didn't care, because they went and imported more slaves to replace the ones who fell in this gruesome practice. So, of course, there was slavery on the continent as well. This began, it's estimated, by the Spanish in 1501, and was entrenched in Florida and other places that the Spanish controlled. There was also some slavery among the Indians. People make a point it was a different kind of slavery. It was when people were captured in war. But I wouldn't say it was particularly benign, because among those fates that would face a slave taken in war was the possibility of being an object of ritual sacrifice or something of that sort. So, but there was slavery here on the continent by the Spanish and also by the Dutch. The Dutch established New York City, New Amsterdam in 1624, and they were major slave traders and established slavery there prior to their deal with the British, who took it over. This, by the way, is the wall that they built to keep out the Indians. Some people say that wall is what Wall Street comes from. There also, later on, was a major slave market right next to that Wall Street. So the Dutch were here, the Spanish were here, and so forth. So what is that perspective does that give us on Jamestown 1619, which we've heard so much about? First, there is, you realize that nobody ordered these, commissioned these slaves, this slave ship to come in. It was a British ship that had captured the slaves from a Portuguese slave ship. And the British guys who owned this ship, the White Lion, were apparently starving, hungry, and they traded their cargo for food. What happened to those slaves is not totally known. People have tracked down that at least 2 of them were treated as indentured servants and eventually became free. We don't know. There were between 20 and 30. I've seen different figures of slaves that were bartered for food by this British ship. But that tells you something about what the conditions were in the Virginia colony at that point, because there was no legal establishment of slavery there. What there was primarily indentured servants, and blacks and whites were indentured servants. However, as in the Caribbean, what happened was that the conditions of growing, the demand for profit, whatever, that the owners of the plantations demanded, increasingly made it hard to get indentured servants to come. Plus there was disease, plus there were Indian conflicts, and so forth. So, as in the Caribbean, there was a tendency to say, solve our problem, so-called, with slavery. But slavery was not actually codified in law until 1662, about 40 years afterwards. It's at that point that Virginia law says that the offspring of a slave mother is a slave. Prior to that time, you don't have the hereditary nature of slavery. You did have brutality. You had, mutilations. You had killings, but it's documented that you had them both among those considered slaves and those who were indentured servants. But the indentured servants and Native Americans, who were also in some cases enslaved. The Native Americans were always more difficult because they knew the land and they could get away better. So it took that time for this thing to begin to be ingrained in law. Now, conditions, however, for everybody in terms of the plantation life, indentured servants and slaves, were very bad and grueling and inhuman. And in 1676, there's a rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion. Now, if you look this up, what you will see is that this was done in order to demand that the governor of Virginia protect people on the frontier from Indian attacks, and that it was an anti-Indian rebellion. From what I've read, that is part of the question, but the major cause that historians attribute this rebellion to were the inhuman conditions of labor, lack of compensation, lack of freedom, and so forth that were allotted to those who were working. And what really upset the powers that be in Virginia is that there was collaboration between the indentured servants that were black and indentured servants that were white and slaves that were black. This was looking like it could be a very serious attempt to topple the established order. And therefore, things after that rebellion got worse and worse and worse. And eventually, in terms of the crackdown of conditions, particularly to separate the races and to codify the racial horrors of the slave trade, slave code and treatment. 1705 is when this actually gets put in the most laid out form of allowing all sorts of atrocities against slaves without any legal repercussion whatsoever on those who did it, and establishing outright that that Negroes were chattel. Before that, that didn't exist, but that's pretty horrible. It did. Now, just as in this overview, I think it's important to also recognize something else, which is we've seen how it was a gradual process in Virginia and obviously a worsening process because the more slaves there were, the more this became entrenched. But South Carolina was the only colony that was actually established as a slave colony. The people who established South Carolina, also we have Charles II, must have been pretty a horrible fellow. He gave them the land, and they mostly came from plantation owners on Barbados, which had a record of being the most brutal of all the colonies in the Caribbean. They had were established in 1663. They had slaves from the beginning by law, and their first constitution, 1669, had slavery codified by law with no rights whatsoever. So that's the only colony in the United States that began that way. And to try to get an overview, the major statistics you can find, obviously everything is estimated, Um, the the importations. It's not so much how many slaves were here until you have a census, which is 1790. So this is from Gilder Lehman Institute, of one of the New York historical institutes. And the bottom line on this is you see the major growth being in the 1720s to the 1780s. That's when it really takes off and becomes extremely intense. So and after that, well, obviously we know the number of slaves in the United States grew massively. It was mainly through people having babies and the slavery growing that fast. So the early opposition, let us turn to that. And because it actually existed from the very beginning, very close to the beginning. The first is 1652, Roger Williams of Rhode Island. You might expect that, I suppose. Roger Williams established Rhode Island a couple of decades before this in opposition to stringent rules in Massachusetts, and therefore he could be expected to have taken this move for freedom of all races in Rhode Island. This didn't last. It was overturned in 1700, but that was the first official action that I know of against slavery among the colonies. And that tendency did not totally die. And then we come to the Quakers in Pennsylvania. We're going to hear a lot about Quakers in Pennsylvania because they actually were a major force of anti-slavery activity throughout the early period. This is, there was a petition, actually it wasn't discovered until, the physical copy was not discovered until a couple decades ago, that was done by a Friends Meeting House in Germantown, Pennsylvania. It was done by a group of 4 men who were German immigrants, a guy named Daniel Pastorius, and this is the little house where they did it. It was a group of friends, right, Quakers, and they are considered the first to have put out a petition. Now, the petition was to other Quakers. It was not a petition to the government. And these are some of the quotes of that, from that petition. It's mild-mannered, one might very much think, explaining why they're against the traffic. But they say very clearly, you know, liberty is just as important to blacks as it is to whites, and there's a saying, we should do to men what we want done to ourselves. Very strong argument, which most of these documents that we're going to be looking at say about theft, right? The theft of people from the African continent and making it a crime, and just as much of a crime for those who accept the product of the theft knowingly as those who carried out the theft. And then, of course, raising the question of their fight for freedom. So this was 1688. It went to the higher bodies of the Quaker establishment. Quakers, by the way, you know, William Penn has a great reputation as a philanthropist and someone who was committed to freedom, but he was a slave owner, as the majority of Quakers, I'm told, you know, as I've read, were. So this was not immediately embraced at all as and the fact that these fellows came from Germany was considered one reason why they had this view, because the slavery was not so much entrenched in Germany as it was in other parts of the world. The second Quaker who begins to make a fuss is this guy, George Keith. He is mostly located in England, although he's not, he does come to the colonies. He works in New Jersey as a surveyor. He travels around even with the founders of Quakerism, and he gets kicked out of one Quaker meeting after another. They say, you're not a member, you're too controversial, you're too problematic. So what happened was that he went from meeting to meeting attempting to personally convert people to get rid of their slaves. And in 1693, he published a caution to Friends, those are Quakers, against buying or keeping Negroes, not simply the trade, making the very strong religious point, which is going to be made by a lot of these people, that all men are entitled to the freedom of white men. So only buy a Negro if you're going to set them free. Buying stolen goods unchristian, stolen men worse. Do unto what men should do unto you, do unto them. Now, switching for the moment, since we're going somewhat chronologically to New England again, this is a very prominent person from Boston, Massachusetts, or actually probably from one of the small towns around Boston, because he was a judge. He was a very prominent, these other people were not prominent officials in their location. But this guy, Sewall, was. He was married into wealth, he was part of the elite, and he ultimately became a judge. He's notorious for playing a pretty rotten role in the Salem witch trials, but he's the only judge who then recanted and said this was a mistake and publicly apologized and this and that. So he jumped into the fray initially to defend a man who was being threatened with slavery by another individual. I think the man whose name was Adam had actually escaped slavery, and then the man was trying to get him back. And this guy, Sewall, said, no, that's absolutely against the laws that we have to live by. And he wrote a piece, very short piece actually, in 1700 called The Selling of Joseph. It was a total sensation. He took the case of the selling of Joseph into slavery, the son of Jacob, I guess. You know the story from the Bible of the brothers selling the favorite youngest son into slavery in Egypt and so forth. This is what he takes from, and he says that was totally illegitimate, and any kind of selling of human beings is illegitimate of us today. Because one of the arguments that was constantly made is by those who were defending slavery is, well, it's in the Bible, so why not? I mean, some Jews, founding fathers of Judaism, carried out slavery. He makes the argument that is absolutely not the case. So it's internal to Christian text in many respects, but it is at the same time very general in terms of the assertion of natural law. All men, sons of Adam, have an equal right to liberty. That is it. Now, they do succeed in the case of this particular fellow Adam, keeping him out of slavery. But this doesn't really have an effect on policy in Massachusetts. As he says, there's numerous slaves in the province, although much less than in the southern part of the country. And that is what, but he takes a stand, and it makes a sensation. Also in New England, you have Cotton Mather, another member of the elite, son of a noted scientist. Was in the Royal Society, was a minister at one of the major churches there. And he was notable for the fact that he went against the idea of education for the enslaved. He, from the beginning of his, as far as I know, throughout his ministry, was committed to an education, a religious education, for the enslaved population as well as the free black population. He wasn't what you would call today an enlightened person in terms of preventing segregation or anything like that, but he was committed to education. And this very important statement that, and commitment and acting on that commitment, that the minds of people of the African race were the absolute equal of the minds of those white Americans who otherwise looked down on them. Very important point in the whole argument which occurs. And he had a project. He set up a Society of Negroes, which was a Bible study, basically, and in 1693. And while it may seem quaint or even backward to us today, in those days it was a major slap in the face to the major ethos of the establishment. Now we have the special case of Georgia, which I've just written. I'm writing a book, as I told you. I've written a chapter, drafted a chapter on it, and this particular case is written up in my blog, if you want to look at it. But I want to give you an idea of it here because, you know, I think this is, again, something which very too few Americans are aware of, because it gives you just a much more reticulated sense of what fights were going on, what the mentality was in the early United States, or the pre-United States American colonies. Now, Georgia, you've probably been told, it was founded by a bunch of convicts. Well, who were the convicts? The convicts were debt prisoners in England. And James Oglethorpe, who was a member of Parliament, prominent guy again, working with other members of Parliament, began to campaign to have this colony founded because tens of thousands of Britons of impoverished people, were being thrown in debtor's prison to rot. Obviously, that wasn't helping them pay their debts. And he apparently had a friend who committed suicide in order to prevent being sent back to debtor's prison. So his efforts and those of his collaborators were to change the law in order to free a lot of these debtors. He's credited with having freed up to 100,000 people from debtor's prison. So the idea of Georgia, in his mind, was a place where these people could go and start a new life, right? And from the beginning, the rules of the trustees. And it was a proprietary colony. It was not run by the crown, but it was supported by the parliament financially. They set up this colony to bring over these former debtors to have them farm, and they sold it to the government by saying this is a buffer against the Spanish, this is going to produce wealth for us, etc., etc. But slavery should not be allowed because we're out to relieve the distressed, and if you bring in slaves, you not only are undercutting the potential for the white population, but you're also participating in the horrors of the slave trade. Now, Georgia did, there was always a fight as to change this policy. That fight was obviously very heated in London, but it was also heated here by the founders of South Carolina. If this is happening in 1733, South Carolina is really, by the time Georgia's founded, South Carolina is 60% black, 60% enslaved, right? So just like Barbados, just like the islands. So they wanted room to expand, and they didn't like this example of a colony right next door to them where slavery was banned. So they kept trying to offer, to rent out slaves to people who lived there. And they argued that only slaves could do the grueling work in the southern climate. And Oglethorpe's allies in defending this idea that you should not have slavery were from two different groups of immigrants, at least two specialized ones. I'm sure there were many just plain old Britons, but the specialized ones were the Highland Scots and these people called the Salzburgers. These were a particular Lutheran group that had been persecuted by the Austrian Empire, got permission to be sent over here. And what the importance of them is that they were an example of proving that you could have a productive economy without slavery, because their section of Georgia was extremely prosperous and they didn't have any slaves. And they supported, they would write petitions. Well, the South Carolinians would say, go in to talk to the residents of Georgia and say, why do you want to work so hard? We just have slave labor and you wouldn't have to work so hard and so forth. These guys would write petitions back defending the ban on slavery. One of the collaborators, interestingly enough, of Oglethorpe was a leading abolitionist in England named Thomas Bray. We will meet him later, but I think I better move right along here. He is also known for setting up schools for both free and enslaved blacks and seeking abolition. Now, Oglethorpe succeeds in beating back the opposition for approximately 17 years. With the initial opposition, he gets Parliament to pass a law in 1735 saying there can be no slavery here. That gets overturned in 1751 when, unfortunately, Oglethorpe is off the scene, and there's an erosion of support, and the South Carolina affiliated group basically takes over, and you have Georgia ultimately become, with South Carolina, the major defender of maintaining slavery in the early deliberations on our government. Okay. Opposition escalates. So we're in the we're in the beginning of the 18th century. This is an intense period of slave importation. And there begins to be parliamentary action and increased agitation against it. The first government action, in addition to Rhode Island that I mentioned before, that I know of that occurred was in Pennsylvania, where they attempted in 3 times, 1712, 1417, to ban imports, to put a confiscatory tax on slaves, and this is vetoed by the Crown. You don't want to mess with our income, so therefore we will not let you do this. So this failure to succeed in curbing slavery does lead to more agitation, particularly among the more radical Quakers. And it starts off, the most dramatic example is this fellow by the name of Benjamin Lay. Oh, wait a minute, I'm missing one of my slides. Oh, shoot. Anyway, Benjamin Lay, there was a picture of him in that slide that you didn't see. He was a dwarf, right? He was about 4 feet, and he looked really strange, right? He had a huge head and spindly legs and so forth. He was called the Quaker Comet, right? Because he would go into Quaker meetings and spurt blood all over people and say, blood is on your hands until you get rid of slavery and so forth. He was he had actually spent time in Barbados and seen the brutality of slavery there. He'd seen a slave commit suicide rather than get his weekly whipping, and he was determined to do something, and he was not well accepted, just like the earlier guys in the Quaker community. But he kept at it. In 1738, he puts out a book, and it's, as you see, he's very accusatory. You're an apostate. You can't be a Christian if you are a slave keeper. And that book is printed by Benjamin Franklin, who is considered by most historians to come late to the anti-slavery fight. But while clearly Ben Franklin was pragmatic in numerous of the things he did, and I certainly wouldn't embrace all of his arguments, he constantly, from the 1720s when he began to be a printer on, facilitated the printing of anti-slavery material, considerable amount of anti-slavery material, and ultimately became the center of international collaboration against slavery. So now what's the next? Now, the significant thing that Franklin adds to the whole fight, I mean, you've seen the religious argument, do unto others as you'd have them do to you. You've seen the theft argument. You've seen some of the mental capacity argument, but Franklin puts in the economic argument. And as you know, he committed his life to scientific progress, right? He was a scientist, he wanted to see social improvements and greater conditions of life for everyone. And that was one of the aspects of that, like with my friend Alexander Hamilton, was developing manufactures. And the British, of course, were attempting to prevent the American colonies from becoming a manufacturing center by various laws banning the finishing of iron, hats, and other kinds of uh, things that they sold that they wanted to have the Americans simply send them the raw materials. They would do the production, and then buy what the British produced at whatever price the British decided to give them. So in 1751, one of the articles that Franklin writes is an argument for increasing the population of the colonies as a road to increased prosperity. You see this, observations concerning the increase of the people of the colonies. And in that he attacks slavery for economic reasons. He says what diminishes your country is the introduction of slaves. Earlier on, he says, some people say that if we have slaves, we can beat the British economically by paying less for our labor. He says, well, you can never improve your economy by decreasing your investment in your labor. That just doesn't work. Because treating people effectively, he doesn't say it this way, but it doesn't work, because treating people like beasts does not improve the productivity of an economy. You have to educate them, you have to provide decent standards of living, you have to have a living culture in order to increase the productivity of your society. So number 6 in this tract was that the introduction of slaves has diminished us. It's not only diminished us by the fact that other immigrants don't want to come or are deprived of employment because people prefer to employ slave labor, but it also has a terrible effect on the white population. People don't want to work, and they decide not to be productive themselves. They're rendered unfit to get a living by industry. And if you know anything about Benjamin Franklin, industry is one of his major qualities and commands for what is needed in order to make progress for the individual and for the country as a whole. Now that piece, that observations on the increase of mankind, is not simply a local matter. That piece is translated into French, it goes to England, it's circulated widely, and the argument that slavery is an economic detriment to a country is picked up, and he is widely cited. Remember that by this time, 1751, Franklin is a noted international scientist, right? He has tremendous respect internationally. The agitation continues. You have more from the Quakers. This fellow, John Woolman, was a little bit more politic, or a great deal more politic, than Benjamin Lay. He was a businessman, but he succeeded in stroking the egos of the Quaker establishment so that they actually considered his arguments against slavery. The benefit of that was essentially to be able to get the word out more broadly. But he also produced a tract. These tracts were very widely circulated. Now, it's not simply Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. I wouldn't want to eliminate Virginia. probably the leading anti-slavery person in Virginia is George Wythe, who you see was around for quite a long time. He is noted for on the question of equal education for blacks and whites. Of course, almost all education there was private tutoring, but he did do private tutoring of blacks as well as of the enslaved, actually, as well as whites. And he had his ideas about the equality of all men and the end of slavery were heard in all of these major defining moments and individuals of our government. And by pure abolition, what is meant is just freedom, right? No compensation, no, anything like that. You also had in this 1720s and 30s, which you may be familiar with, called the Great Awakening, a lot of religious revivals and spread of itinerant ministers and so forth. You may associate that, even negatively today, but at that point, a major element of it was often against slavery. And one of the ministers who carried that message to both black and white audiences was George Whitefield. He unfortunately eventually turned bad and had a plantation in Georgia. But the reason I say but is because his message long before that survived and reached millions of people and had an impact regardless of what he personally did later on. And the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. This was a surprise to me until I saw a letter by Abraham Lincoln written during the war, thanking the Methodists for being the denomination that provided the most support for the hospitals for the Union soldiers in the war. I never thought of Methodism as being established as anti-slavery, but and of course the denomination, like many others, split at the time of the Civil War. Became the Southern Methodists and the Northern Methodists. But John Wesley was a crusader against slavery, and he was considered to be the founder of the emotional school against slavery, whereas others were arguing from the Bible or, arguing from natural law or arguing from economic perspective. He argued from what you see. Are you a man? Don't you see a man in front of you? Don't you respond like a human being? This is not his bad grammar. That's the way they wrote. And of course, what many of these crusaders at that time would conclude with is, if we don't succeed in ending this crime against humanity effectively, then God is going to deal with you. You're going to suffer in blood. That's what will happen. And that brings us to what is my final slide in the transition to the next class, which is back to Pennsylvania and one of the key international figures of the next phase of the anti-slavery movement in the American colonies and internationally. And that's this fellow, Anthony Benezet. He is actually, Wesley quoted heavily from him in his tract against slavery. He wrote a whole number of books against slavery. He was did a unique, two significant unique things, I believe. One is he actually delved into what the situation was in Africa and gave the lie to the story that, well, things were so bad in Africa, it was better off that they come here. He said Africa didn't have all those wars and everything until the slave traders showed up. Guinea was the country that he particularly studied, and wrote a book about the actual situation in Guinea and then what happened when the slave traders showed up. And next, he also interviewed ship captains on slave ships, and one of his major books, which we'll talk about more next time, in 1766, featured the testimony of those who had actually participated in the slave trade, and was a powerful argument that the trade and the practice had to stop. He begins teaching both the enslaved and free blacks in the 1750s, setting up schools, and the story will continue from there. And that's what I have for today. Marcy?
Okay, I have a question. I'm a numbers person. I like to think of numbers a bit. But what I'm thinking is that there's been a lot of effort to end slavery, prevent slavery, whatever, throughout all this period of time. But clearly it wasn't successful. And I know that'll be our next part of the discussion. But when I look at, there's a fair amount of people that are against it. But what is the population? I mean, the white population is quite small. And then the slave population is, quite a bit smaller. But across the nation at these times, Nancy, like in 1700.
Well, I know at the time of I'll have to look up any more details, but at the time of the Revolution, or I don't know whether it's the Revolution or whether I think it's the time of the Declaration. They say we had approximately 3 million people and 500,000 were enslaved.
Wow. Okay. So it's a big percentage.
It's about 20%. They said about 20%, with a variation of approximately 1% in the far north to over 50% in Carolina.
Okay.
So Virginia, I believe, had the most numbers, because Carolina is a much smaller colony than Virginia. I do, actually, if I can find it.
I mean, I don't mean to be precise about it. It was just kind of that proportion, 20%.
Right. It was considered to be 20%, but as I said, it varied quite a bit in terms of one locale to the other.
Sure, Maine to the Carolinas would probably be very.
Well, no Maine at that time. Maine was Massachusetts.
Right. Are there any other questions? I don't see anybody.
I have a comment, and perhaps maybe Nancy could shed some more light on it. I don't know if I'm the only one that had never heard of the Dunmore Proclamation, which I learned about earlier this week in one of my other classes, that in November of 1775, the British did a Dunmore Proclamation, which was offering the slaves in the colonies to be emancipated if they would fight for the crown, I think is how that went. Do you know anything more about that?
Yeah, I was going to talk about that next time, but
okay,
I,
never mind.
because chronologically it comes later. But it was a Virginia-based thing. The governor of Virginia issued the order, and it was an appeal to the enslaved of the rebels, not of the loyalists, that they would be freed if they joined the war on the British side.
That'll be interesting to hear about it next week then.
Yeah, I mean, there's more to say about what was going on in the military, British military and the other side, and more to say on the impact of what Dunmore said. From what I've read, Dunmore was not didn't do this with authorization from higher up. He did it because he felt desperate in the military situation he was in. But if it's okay with you, we can discuss that more next week in the whole military, because there's a lot to say about the military, about slavery in the context of the military conflict.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Susan?
Yeah, this may be more for next week also, but I just happened to be listening to a podcast about the Haitian slave revolt and Thomas Jefferson's foreign policy in Asia and Haiti in response to that. I was just thinking, was there ever a debate or anything between Jefferson and Franklin in the different years? I mean, besides.
Well, you see, Jefferson, there are two things you can say about Jefferson. One is he changed his tune a lot from 1770s to the end of his life, right? From saying that slavery has to be ended, to saying that the Missouri Compromise, even trying to eliminate slavery in the territories was a horrible thing. He totally. The other thing that is said about Jefferson is that he was a person who had difficulty putting his actions together with his words. He would say one thing and not act on it. And thirdly, that he never accepted, and this is in writing, that blacks' minds were equal to those of whites. I mean, he wrote something called Notes on Virginia in 1782. And in there he said, well, some people have said that if circumstances changed, that blacks could be as educated as, as brilliant as I am. No, I mean, he didn't put it that way, but, could be, have great minds. But, it's never been shown, and, I have my doubts, and, so forth and so on. And, they're good at music, but they're not, but higher thoughts, really, I'm not convinced. Well, when he was living, Benjamin Banneker was living,
Mm.
And Benjamin Banneker, whom I unfortunately know very little about, but because I haven't studied him, but maybe somebody else has or will, is was a very accomplished scientist. Plus, Jefferson was an internationalist. I mean, he probably knew great black composers in France, of which there were some, and so forth. So somehow he had that idea, that he couldn't, brilliant as he may have been in other respects, he acted on that idea. I'm not going to talk a lot about Jefferson later, so I will talk about him. Well, I will have to talk about him, but because of the shift in 1800. But it's absolutely the case that, Hamilton was who wasn't in government at the time, but Hamilton was called upon and advised, having trade with and diplomatic relations with the black Haitian government. When Jefferson came in, he cut it off. That was shocking to me when I learned that. But it's absolutely the case. Because he said, these people, killed white Frenchmen. Well, not all of them had that. There were different phases of the Haitian Revolution also. The hero, Toussaint Louverture, who was ultimately betrayed by the French and killed in prison, was in favor of collaboration between the races in trying to build the economy, whereas others, were out for revenge, right? So, it depends on your perspective, how you approach freedom under those circumstances. Are you looking to build the country, which Toussaint was, or are you motivated by rage? So, which is understandable in some respect, but, it's not looking at the future. So anyway, that's what I would say about Haiti. Except that, I really encourage you, if you're at all interested in what I'm talking about, to get on the blog or subscribe to the blog, because it doesn't cost any money and I don't ask for any money and so forth and so on. But it's americansystemnow.com, and I have a couple of things on Haiti there that I think you might find quite interesting, because I've heard a couple lectures about it which were highly informative, and looked into it myself. Sean?
Here we go. You can hear me now. Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to
Raised my
comment.
hand several times. Obviously,
Oh,
excuse
I'm
me.
sorry, Elizabeth. I didn't
No,
see.
I just wondered if you put your yellow hand on, can you see that actually? I just wanted to hear that for
No,
clarification when you do this. You
That's
don't see it.
I didn't see it. Honestly, I
Okay,
didn't
that's
see
all
it.
right. Go on. I wait for Sean.
I didn't either, sorry.
I was just going to say that the Barbados was a horror story as a slave owner, as you mentioned. And of course, they brought the horrible way they treated people, the blacks in particular, to South Carolina. But in New England, after King Philip's rebellion was suppressed, the New Englanders, what that they did was they sent most of their prisoners to Barbados specifically. And then you also have in the 1715, 1745, you have the two Scottish rebellions. And when the Scots were defeated, they were those that survived were also sent to Barbados deliberately.
Well, that was in England, right? That was in the British Isles, right?
Yeah, the Barbados were in the Scot. It was the Stuarts against the Hanoverians.
Right. The Jacobite. I think they call it the Jacobite Rebellion or something.
Right, and so that when they lost, their people were all those who they didn't kill were sent off to Barbados.
Right.
And of course, they didn't last very long.
No, that's for sure.
And that
Elizabeth.
was the,
Yeah.
Not
Elizabeth.
You mentioned Gilder Lehrman. I have listened to many lectures at Gilder Lehrman. It's a great organization, and they have discussions about books and other things. And one of them was by Julie Wind, Between Slavery and Freedom, Free People of Color in America from Settlement to the Civil War. And she begins that book also, like you did, about the slaves actually not coming to America and eventually coming from Haiti to Charleston, South Carolina, bringing Gala with him and a lot of their customs that they had. My question is also, she raised the issue about buying your freedom. At what point were slaves able to work for their freedom? I mean, what time period did that begin?
It depends. In that period before the codification of slavery in Virginia, if you were an indentured servant, you could buy your freedom.
Yeah.
Right. So to the extent that they were treated as indentured servants, you could buy your freedom. Once slavery was instituted, it's Virginia that I know. I don't know the other. I don't know that anybody in South Carolina could buy their freedom. But I do know someone had to buy them in order and then free them. I mean, that's what happened with Frederick Douglass, for God's sake, in Maryland. But in Virginia, you were, until 1782, you were not allowed to manumit your slaves. I mean, the slave owners were not even allowed to let them, to free them. Yeah. So you certainly couldn't buy your freedom. Before that, potentially, I suppose you could buy it after, if the master decided that he wanted compensation. But we have a lot of very trenchant stuff in the next period of history that addresses this paradox of the calls for freedom by the American patriots and their policy towards slaves. Okay. And there's another book, I mean, you said that this woman, there's another book by Edmund Morgan on Virginia. I'll get you the title of it, exact title, which goes through step by step how slavery was entrenched in Virginia from the earliest time till later. Yes, Ree.
Thank you.
I was surprised, and I think I heard you correctly, that Quakers also had slaves.
Yes.
Was it in the North?
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, in other places. They were businessmen, right? I mean, this is relevant to my main hypothesis that if you want to have a moral treatment of people, you have to have a moral political economy. Your economic system has to be moral, right? And if your political economy, if your economic system simply says, buy cheap, sell dear, trade, make your money off trading, do your beat out the other guy. These guys were traitors, right? And they were also, a lot of Quakers were really bad in the Revolutionary War. They didn't, they used the fact that they were against the military to say, we're not in the army, but sell to both sides, right? So, or who can ever give us the most? Oh yeah, George, we can't give you any grain because we sold it to the British. I mean, it's that kind of mentality. Now that's not everybody, but it was but they were adapted. There were people, it ranged from people who were venal like that to people who just adapted to the economic system. I've been thinking about this, because this whole thing it's very wrenching, to study. It's sort of like the one thing I was thinking today, I hate Walmart, right? To be personal, I really think that they stink, in terms of putting everybody out of business by the cheapest possible, telling them that you have to buy the cheapest possible thing. And probably a lot of Americans hate it too, but they use it because that's what's there. That's what's there. And their circumstances say, well, should I really pay twice as much, or half again as much for X when I can get it cheap at Walmart? I mean, that kind of mentality for the average person. So then it stands to the leaders, right? The leaders of your country. Who's framing your system? And my sense is that the economic system that Hamilton was about setting up, the a manufacturing, industrial, agro-industrial nation, would allow you to have a decent living without slavery. It would encourage you to. You can have a taxation system that does that. You can have a credit system that does that, where you don't get your credit for doing something. You can't borrow money from your bank in order to finance a slave trip, but you can borrow money from the bank in order to invest in an enterprise, right? And pay your free workers, just to come up with some kind of simplified example. So that's, but we'll get into that economic aspect of it for more as we go along, because that really comes in when the government is established. I mean, right now we're dealing with colony by colony and an overarching British political economy, which is pretty brutal, in terms of slavery, and also pretty brutal in terms of industry. Looking at it over there, just think of those debtors' prisons, right?
Yeah, but they could get their freedom back after
Well,
so many
obviously it's
years,
not.
and obviously the African Americans could not,
Susan.
This is a plug for the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts here in Hagerstown. They have an exhibit. I'm not certain how much longer it's going to be, but of a painter, a former slave, Joshua Johnson, who painted portraits in the Baltimore area. He gained his freedom in I think the late 1700s by completing an apprentice in blacksmithing in Baltimore, and he moved around a lot, and he gained a lot of commissions for drawing, and painting white families from Hagerstown to Baltimore, and they have neat little maps that show where he moved around in Baltimore, probably owned a house or two. He was very successful. So get the chance to come up here at the Hagerstown. It's an interesting story to see.
Yeah, my husband and I went to that exhibit a couple weeks ago. They have a deal with somebody where they sometimes get some really good international art too. Because the other thing they have there is Bernini from Italy. Okay, well, we've just about done the time, and
Let's say
Uh,
something about the Quakers. There is a Quaker meeting in Shepherdstown. You know that, I would think.
I don't know Shepherdstown
Oh,
particularly.
you don't? I'm not.
No,
Oh,
I don't live
I'm
in
not sure where
Shepherdstown.
you're from, so I'm sorry. I didn't read your bio. So
No, I live in Northern Virginia. I live about 40 miles away.
yeah. So
But that's, I just don't. I
But
know
for
there were a
those-
lot of Quakers in my part of Loudoun County, town called Waterford and Lincoln and so
Yeah.
forth. Yes.
Mhm.
And Quakers did become very active, were an active part of what went on later as well. But but in the early period when they were established, they were part of the establishment,
Yes.
the
Oh,
business
I know.
establishment.
Yeah, I am a Quaker, so I have studied the history. And I
Right.
restarted a Quaker meeting in Charleston, South Carolina in 1977. And the last Quakers left there in 1837 because they were worried what was going on in Charleston and what was coming.
Right.
That's, yeah,
Wow, that's an interesting story. All right. So I'll see you next week. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.